Chapter 11. The Supreme Measure. Capital punishment has had an up-and-down history in Russia. In the code of the Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich Romanov, there were 50 crimes for which capital punishment could be imposed. By the time of the military statutes of Peter the Great, there were 200. Yet the Empress Elizabeth, while she did not repeal those laws authorizing capital punishment, never once resorted to it. They say that when she ascended the throne, she swore an oath never to execute anyone. And for all 20 years of her reign, she kept that oath. She fought the 7 Years' War, yet she still got along without capital punishment. It was an astounding record in the mid-18th century, 50 years before the guillotine of the Jacobins. True, we have taught ourselves to ridicule all our past. We never acknowledge a good deed or a good intention in our history. And one can very easily blacken Elizabeth's reputation, too. She replaced capital punishment with flogging with the knout, tearing out nostrils, branding with the word thief, and eternal exile in Siberia. But let us also say something on behalf of the Empress. How could she have changed things more radically than she did in contravention of the social concepts of her time? And perhaps the prisoner condemned to death today would voluntarily consent to that whole complex of punishments if only the sun would continue to shine on him. But we, in our humanitarianism, don't offer him that chance. And perhaps the reader will come to feel, in the course of this book, that 20 or even 10 years in our camps are harder to bear than were the punishments of Elizabeth. In today's terms, Elizabeth had a universally human point of view on all this, while the Empress Catherine the Great had, on the contrary, a class point of view, which was consequently more correct. Not to execute anyone at all seemed to her appalling and indefensible. She found capital punishment entirely appropriate to defending herself, her throne, and her system. In other words, in political cases, such as those of Mirovic, the Moscow Plague Mutiny, and Pugachev, but for habitual criminals, for non-political offenders, why not consider capital punishment abolished? Under Paul, the abolition of capital punishment was confirmed. Despite his many wars, there were no military tribunals attached to a military unit. Despite his many wars, there were no military tribunals attached to military units. And during the whole long reign of Alexander I, capital punishment was introduced only for war crimes that took place during a campaign, 1812. Right at this point, some people will say to us, what about the deaths running from the gantlet? Yes, indeed, there were, of course, hidden executions, for that matter. One can literally drive a person to death with a trade union meeting. But the gilling up of one's God-given life because others, sitting in judgment, have so voted simply did not take place in our country even for crimes of state for an entire half-century, from Pugachev to the Decembrists. The blood of the 5 Decembrists whetted the appetite of our state. From then on, execution for crimes of the state was no longer prohibited, nor was it forgotten, right up to the February Revolution in 1917. It was confirmed by the statutes of 1845 and 1904, and further reinforced by the criminal statutes of the Army and Navy. And how many people were executed in Russia during that period? We have already, in Chapter 8 above, cited the figures given by liberal leaders of 1905 to 1907. Let us add to them the verified figures of N.S. Tagintsev, the expert on Russian criminal law. Up until 1905, the death penalty was an exceptional measure in Russia. For a period of 30 years, from 1876 to 1904, the period of the Narodnaya revolutionaries and the use of terrorism, a terrorism which did not consist merely of intentions murmured in the kitchen of a communal apartment, a period of mass strikes and peasant revolts, the period when the parties of the future revolution were created and grew in strength, 486 people were executed. In other words, about 17 people per year for the whole country. This figure includes executions of ordinary non-political criminals. During the years of the First Revolution, 1905, and its suppression, the number of executions rocketed upward, astounding Russian imaginations, calling forth tears from Tolstoy and indignation from Korolenko, and many, many others. From 1905 through 1908, about 2,200 persons were executed, 45 a month. This, as Tangetsev said, was an epidemic of executions. It came to an abrupt end. When the provisional government came to power, it abolished capital punishment entirely. In July 1917, however, it was reinstated in the active army and frontline areas for military crimes, murder, rape, assault, and pillage, very widespread in those areas at that time. This was one of the most unpopular of the measures which destroyed the provisional government. The Bolshevik slogan before the Bolshevik coup d'etat was, "Down with capital punishment, reinstated by Kerensky." If we are to judge by official documents, capital punishment was restored in all its force in June 1918. No, it was not restored. Instead, a new era of executions was inaugurated. If one takes the view that Latsis is not deliberately understating the real figures, but simply lacks complete information, and that the Rev tribunals carried on approximately the same amount of judicial work as the Cheka performed in an extrajudicial way, one concludes that the 20 central provinces of Russia, in a period of 16 months, June 1918 to October 1919, more than 16,000 persons were shot, which is to say, more than 1,000 a month. However, it may not even have been these individual executions, with or without formally pronounced death sentences, which added up to thousands and inaugurated the new era of executions in 1918 that stunned and froze Russia. Still more terrible to us was the practice, initially followed by warring sides and later by the victors only, of sinking barges loaded with uncounted, unregistered hundreds, unidentifiable even by a roll call. Naval officers in the Gulf of Finland, in the White, Caspian, and Black Seas, and, as late as 1920, hostages in Lake Baikal. This is outside the scope of our narrow history of courts and trials, but it belongs to the history of morals, which is where everything else originates as well. In all our centuries, from the first Ryurik on, had there ever been a period of such cruelties and so much killing as during the post-October Civil War? At one time, 265 condemned prisoners were awaiting execution in Leningrad's Kresty prison alone, and during that whole year it would certainly seem that more than 1,000 were shot in Kresty alone. And what kind of evildoers were these condemned men? Where did so many plotters and troublemakers come from? Among them, for example, were 6 collective farmers from nearby Tsarskoye Selo who were guilty of the following crime. After they had finished mowing down the collective farm with their own hands, they had gone back and mowed a second time along the hummocks to get a little hay for their own cows. The All-Russian Central Executive Committee refused to pardon all 6 of these peasants, and the sentence of execution was carried out. What cruel and evil Salchika, what utterly repulsive and infamous serf owner would have killed 6 peasants for their miserable little clippings of hay? If one had dared to beat them with birch switches even once, we would know about it and read about it in school and curse that name. But now, heave the corpses into the water, and pretty soon the surface is all smooth again and no one's the wiser. And one must cherish the hope that someday documents will confirm the report of my witness, who is still alive. Even if Stalin had killed no others, I believe he deserved to be drawn and quartered just for the lives of those 6 Tsarskoye Selo peasants. And yet they still dare shriek at us, from Peking, from Tirana, from Tbilisi, yes, and plenty of big bellies in the Moscow suburbs are doing it too. How could you dare expose him? How could you dare disturb his great shade? Stalin belongs to the world communist movement. But in my opinion, all he belongs to is the criminal code. The peoples of all the world remember him as a friend, but not those on the backs he rode, whom he slashed with his knout. However, let us return to being dispassionate and impartial once more. Of course, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee would certainly have completely abolished the supreme measure, as promised. But unfortunately, what happened was that in 1936, the father and teacher completely abolished the All-Russian Central Executive Committee itself, and the Supreme Soviet that succeeded it had an 18th century ring. The supreme measure became a punishment once again, and ceased to be some kind of incomprehensible social defense. As for the executions of 1937 to 1938, what legal expert, what criminal historian will provide us with verified statistics? Where is that special archive we might be able to penetrate in order to read the figures? There is none. There is none, and there never will be any. Therefore, we dare report only those figures mentioned in rumors that were quite fresh in 1939 to 1940, when they were drifting around under the Butyrki arches, having emanated from the high and middle-ranking Yezhov men of the NKVD who had been arrested and had passed through those cells not long before. And they really knew. The Yezhov men said that during those 2 years of 1937 to 1938, 500,000 political prisoners had been shot throughout the Soviet Union, and 480,000 blatnye, habitual thieves, in addition. According to the testimony from Krasnodar, in 1937 to 1938, in the main building of the GPU on the Proletarskaya Street, they shot more than 200 people every night. In May 1947, Iosif Vissarionovich inspected his new starched dicky in his mirror, liked it, and dictated to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet the decree on the abolition of capital punishment in peacetime. Replacing it with a new maximum term of 25 years, it was a good pretext for introducing the so-called quarter. But our people are ungrateful, criminal, and incapable of appreciating generosity. Therefore, after the rulers had creaked along and eked out 2.5 years without the death penalty, on January 12, 1950, a new decree was published that constituted an about-face. In view of petitions pouring in from the national republics, the Ukraine, from the trade unions, oh, those lovely trade unions, they always know what's needed, from peasant organizations, this was dictated by a sleepwalker. The gracious sovereign had stomped to death all peasant organizations way back in the year of the great turning point. And also from cultural leaders. Now that is quite likely. Capital punishment was restored for a conglomeration of traitors to the motherland, spies, and subversive diversionists. And, of course, they forgot to repeal the quarter, the 25-year sentence which remained in force. And once this return to our familiar friend, to our beheading blade, had begun, things went further with no effort at all. In 1954, for premeditated murder. In May 1961, for theft of state property and counterfeiting, and terrorism in places of imprisonment. This was directed especially at prisoners who killed informers and terrorized the camp administration. In July 1961, for violating the rules governing foreign currency transactions. In February 1962, for threatening the lives of, shaking a fist at, policemen or communist vigilantes, then for rape, and immediately thereafter for bribery. But all of this is simply temporary, until complete abolition, and that's how it's described today, too. And so it turns out that Russia managed longest of all without capital punishment in the reign of the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. Thus, many were shot, thousands at first, then hundreds of thousands. We divide, we multiply, we sigh, we curse. But still, and all, these are just numbers. They overwhelm the mind and then are easily forgotten. And if someday the relatives of those who have been shot were to send one publisher photographs of their executed kin, and an album of those photographs were to be published in several volumes, then just by leafing through them and looking into the extinguished eyes, we would learn much that would be valuable for the rest of our lives. Such reading, almost without words, would leave a deep mark on our hearts for all eternity. In one household I am familiar with, where some former Zeks live, the following ceremony takes place. On March 5th, the day of the death of the head murderer, They spread out on the table all the photographs of those who were shot and those who died in camps that they have been able to collect, several dozen of them. And throughout the day, solemnity reigns in the apartment, somewhat like that of a church, somewhat like that of a museum. There is funeral music. Friends come to visit, to look at the photographs, to keep silent, to listen, to talk softly together, and then they leave without saying goodbye. And that is how it ought to be everywhere. At least these deaths would have left a small scar on our hearts, so that they should not have died in vain. And I, too, have such a few chance photographs. Look at these at least. In the book there are 5 photographs of shot people. Viktor Petrovich Porovsky, shot in Moscow in 1918. Alexander Strobinder, a student, shot in Petrograd in 1918. Vasily Ivanovich Anichov, shot in Lubyanka in 1927. Alexander Andreyevich Svezhin, a professor of general staff, shot in 1935. Mikhail Alexandrovich Reformsky, an agronomist, shot in Orel in 1938. Yevgenievna Anikova, shot in a camp on the Yenisei in 1942. They say that Konstantin Rokozovsky, the future marshal, was twice taken into the forest at night for a supposed execution. The firing squad leveled its rifles at him, and then they dropped them, and he was taken back to prison. And this was also making use of the supreme measure as an interrogator's trick. But it was all right, nothing happened, and he is alive and healthy and doesn't even cherish a grudge about it. And almost always, a person obediently allows himself to be killed. Why is it that the death penalty has such a hypnotic effect? Those pardoned recall hardly anyone in their cell who offered any resistance. End of chapter 11.